Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet.
Exactly. And today, well, I'm here. I'm Alex. I am a Next team member, also a web engineering consultant and content creator around in the Vue ecosystem. I'm here with Michael Thiessen today.
And I do education around Vue full time, and that's my job, doing content, courses, articles, all that good stuff, teaching you more about Vue as best as I can. And today we've got a special guest. We've got Evan, the creator of Vue himself.
Hello.
Hey, Evan. How are you doing? Thanks a lot for joining us, first of all.
Yeah, doing great.
Perfect. So yeah, we're looking forward to an episode of lots of interesting questions. And of course, the big topic before the Q&A, 10 years of Vue and 4 years of Vite. First of all, amazing, frameworks nowadays in the JavaScript ecosystem surviving for 10 years, still being actively maintained and used. That's already a great achievement. So yeah, it's crazy. Like also how the ecosystem has developed over the years. What are your general thoughts about the whole progress, the whole journey? Maybe let's say we start with a little summary of how it got started, how you started with Vue over to what it is now.
Yeah. It's a very long story, right? When I got started, it was mostly a side project, like most things in open source. And I put it out there mostly because I felt I've spent a lot of time on this. It would be great if it can be useful to other people. And turns out other people liked it. And we have more and more people that's liking it. So that comes with a lot of motivation and also responsibility. So it kind of pushed me to want to make it better, make it, cater to what the users want. Also, just trying to think about bigger plans, like what can we do outside of just, displaying some templates. So over time, we started adding more and more into the scope of the project. So we started adding single page routing, we added state management, added a tool chain, build tools, we added dev tool extensions, and of course, along the way, adding more features to the core, writing more documentation. So in that process, we started to have people joining the team, people who are passionate about the project as well. So a team kind of formed very organically. And and in 2016, I decided to just do it full time. That's kind of a story of its own. But the idea is, Vue was growing beyond my expectations, really. And I realized there might be something in it that's worth pursuing. And in the beginning, I had no idea how big it's going to be. I had no idea whether even it's going to be sustainable. I just, started doing it mostly because I was quite young and had a bit of savings. And for me, the most important thing at that time was just to be able to focus 100% on the thing I want to do. That's really the main reason I decided to do it full time, right? So the plan was to just keep doing it for a few months. And if it doesn't work, just find another job or whatever. But turns out it worked better than I expected. The sponsorship money slowly grew to the extent where I can just really just work on it full time. So at that point, I was just completely full time open source, and that's probably the most amazing thing ever. I still feel like it was a risky decision, but it's probably the best decision in my life. So
definitely, a big point there. Maybe to take that first part of the journey of Vue. You said, okay, you put it out there, you worked on it as a side project while you were still working on your day-to-day job back then at Meteor, I think?
Started at Google, actually.
Started Google even, okay.
Yeah. So the first commit of Vue, when it was before even called Vue, was when I was in 2013, when I was still working at Google. I left Google in 2014 to join Meteor, and went full-time in 2016. So that's the timeline.
Okay, I see. And you said, you put it out there because you felt it's a cool thing, and apparently other people felt it too. could you trace down like where the initial growth came from? If like, I don't know, number one in Hacker News nowadays, like a big thing. So did you know what happened?
I think the idea is the idea of modern front end, which most of us are kind of taken for granted nowadays, is you have some reactive state. The framework is responsible for mostly two things. One is reactive state, and second is how do you declare what you want to render. And then the framework kind of just links the two together to make it work automatically. Right? And then outside of that, you probably also need a component model so that you can compose larger applications. These are really the three things all modern frameworks provide. That's the bottom value that we see nowadays. But back then, it wasn't that common. I think a lot of people were still using just jQuery spaghetti everywhere. And then a lot of people are using Backbone, which give you some sense of structure, but it wasn't, it doesn't really handle the Vue rendering part. Like the whole like wiring up your state to your rendered view is like manual. It's completely manual, and it's madness. Mm-hmm. So Angular was already out. Knockout was already out there. So these are the early pioneers of AngularJS. That's version 1, right? So these are the early pioneers of like, I think back then, Knockout.js was still known as MVVM. That's Model View View Model. And that's actually the initial term that Vue used to describe itself as well. So it was heavily inspired by Knockout, heavily inspired by AngularJS, and to some extent Backbone. So I think the idea was that the way AngularJS worked aligns better with what people want, because Knockout actually had something called Knockout Observable, which is not to be confused with RxJS observables, but they look almost the same as solid signals today. Mm-hmm. So Knockout was like the first framework to really like introduce like something like a signal in the browser. I like the dependency tracking based reactivity that Knockout had. Right. But at the same time, I also liked the way that you can, like in AngularJS, you can just say this.foo equals something, and things will just update. So I was like, how can I like implement AngularJS without all the extra concepts? Because like there were a lot of additional things like dependency injection, ng module. I'm not sure if it was in AngularJS, but to get started with AngularJS, you had to like learn a bunch of jargons that's typically like kind of carried over from Java, which I didn't know. Like I think I took like one semester of Java in college, but like I just hated Java. I didn't really want to dig into all those concepts. I was like, I'm just working on the front end. I want something that's as simple as possible. I want to link it from a script tag with, write some templates, one line of code. And I want to see it become interactive. That's really like the core experience I wanted for Vue in day one. And when I looked into the implementation of AngularJS, it was using dirty checking. So didn't really like that. Thought it was inefficient and a bit brute force. It was a smart way to get around a lot of the browser engine limitations back then, because I think AngularJS supported all the way back to IE6. But I wanted something that's feels like more elegant, which is dependency tracking, but want the same just like mutate object kind of syntax. So the answer to that was using ES5 getters and setters to intercept all these property operations. But that required ES5, which means Vue started with IE9 as the bottom line support. Right? So in 2013, that was kind of, it's about the time where people are starting to consider dropping IE8 and below, but IE8 was still kind of a big thing that some people are like, if you don't support IE8, I won't ever use your stuff. But for me, it wasn't a problem. I'm like, I don't care about IE8. I'm just going to use ES5. So that's the initial idea. So I made the initial version of Vue. The whole idea is you write some very simple template syntax. You declare an object of your state, and you do new view, and boom, you got a page running. Right? And then I think the standard steps was to replicate a bunch of commonly seen UI examples to verify that your system is actually working. So wrote some documentation and put it out there. I think it came out at the right time with the right level of abstraction, right level of entry to barrier, so that a lot of developers, the early adopters, I believe, for Vue, come from a background where they are not professional front-end developers by trade. They are probably working on some back-end applications like Rails, Laravel, or traditional back-end that's already rendered HTML. They want some interactivity on the page. They're fed up with jQuery spaghetti. They find AngularJS a bit difficult to get into. They find React also difficult to get into, probably because having to require a build tool chain to handle JSX was just a no, it's just deal breaker for a lot of people back then, right?
Probably still today to some degree, right?
Yeah, I mean today, if you're coming up primarily back-end background, a lot of people would still prefer a no build setup, right? Yeah. Or some of them are gravitating more towards HTMX, stuff like that. So traditionally, I think Vue just provided really nice middle ground for a lot of developers who not necessarily want to do heavy investment in front-end engineering setup, but they need, more than trivial interactivity. It's like something that's difficult to handle with just straight up jQuery or DOM manipulation. So I think that's why really it caught on. Allowed you to just write templates on the front end and do interactive stuff with the lowest possible barrier of entry.
Yeah, I think it's also still so nice that you can just straight away start with a script tag. You don't need a build step necessary, even just like to get used to just try it and learn it.
Exactly. So that is something we've always kept all the way through up to Vue 3 today. It's like, but that does come at a cost. Like, in order to get the templates running to be writable directly in the DOM, you have to make it HTML syntax compliant. Right? So we're restricted to syntactically valid HTML, and there are some gotchas. People kind of like the way browser handles raw HTML that you've written. It would format, normalize it in some cases. Sometimes ending tags confuse people. But it's funny because sometimes this ability to run directly in the browser and write your templates directly in the DOM is fundamentally what made Vue popular in the early days. So we stick to that. But for example, something like Svelte, it does not run directly in the browser. It requires a build step.
I need a compiler magic.
Yeah. So, and at the same time, Svelte syntax is more detached from HTML in a way. It's like it adds all these tag syntax to do control flow. It's attribute bindings doesn't have to be within quotes. So the most annoying part about raw HTML is unquoted attributes cannot have spaces. Right? So you cannot use single curlies and then put arbitrary expressions in there. That's so in the past people have asked why don't you just do JSX binding syntax for Vue? It's it goes all the way back to how Vue started, how it was designed, and this requirement of us to allow it to just be written directly in the DOM and compiled is the reason we stick to the syntax.
I mean, you still allow, for example, people to use JSX if they want to with you, which is, I think, not super popular, not super well known, but if people want to do it, especially for authoring libraries, it's super useful there.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's still a lot of people getting into Vue and just dropping in that script tag, or has it shifted more to people being more comfortable with build tools, and so that's less important now than it once was?
I would say objectively, definitely more people are much more comfortable with build tools nowadays. It's much more common to assume you need a build step for your front end. It's also, I would say it's less, overall percentage of people who use Vue without a build step is definitely lower compared to the early days. But the absolute amount of people that still do that is still huge. We still get 1 billion hits on JS Deliver every month. Wow. That's a lot of hits. Right?
Wow, yeah.
And that's just JS Deliver alone. So if you consider all other forms of CDNs, so the absolute number of people who still use Vue that way is just huge.
It must be massive. Also, given all the applications that are written in that way using Vue, and maybe not even getting updated anymore, still being updated because, well, it works, it's fine, and just maybe needs a little bit of progressive enhancement.
Yeah, exactly.
And I also think in a way, like when we as like the Vue community, we often take a look at typical, okay, we have single file components, we have a build step, we have all that, when we build our whole application front end in Vue.js or use a meta framework like Next. Well, sometimes we still forget, okay, there is like inertia.js and Vue and people just using a plain script tag. So sometimes I think this is a little bit forgotten in like the modern quote unquote, or like the typical build step approach. Well, it's still super important, especially for library authors as well, to provide a way so everybody can use the Vue plugins, libraries, and so on.
And I just want to add, like, in a way, Vue definitely, we deviated from the early kind of script tag only kind of use case to expand into a much wider range of use cases, right? So we now have like a full single page application, or you can do full stack with Nuxt. We have all the things to support all that. But in a way, like definitely our main user base has kind of shifted towards a more heavier front end kind of use cases. So I think that actually opened up a bit of a space for even the lighter end than Vue today. For example, Alpine.js, right? I call it Alpine because that's how the F1 team is called. Some people call it Alpine. I think the French pronunciation is Alpine, like Vite. So I think Alpine is cool. Actually uses Vue's reactivity system under the hood, and it just goes a bit more all in towards this like directly in the DOM, directly in the browser kind of approach. So it allows you to directly declare state right in your template. So you don't need to write any JavaScript at all to do a lot of things, and that actually kind of fits the use case of like lightweight progressive enhancement even a bit better than the way Vue it is today. And in a way, Vue proper doesn't really provide any way for you to directly declare your state in your templates, because that would just be very confusing when you mix that with your standard SFC-based dev setup, right? So that's why I built Petite Vue to kind of provide the same functionality. But I feel like Petite Vue was more like a proof of concept, because like this is really something I've always wanted for myself in day one. But today's Vue, our user base have shifted so much, it's just not something suitable for Vue core anymore. So I have to just like put it out in a separate package. But overall, the long-term focus for Vue proper is just to cater to the most dominant use case from our users today. So it's good actually to see something like Alpine that covers, the space that Vue has now left open. And also going back into the server integration side, the Laravel community is, a lot of people are now using Livewire, inertia, right? So I think, that space is more connected to the traditional backend developer space, whereas Vue over time kind of shifted a bit more towards like single page applications, talking to APIs, or full stack with Nuxt.
That makes sense. On that note, I have to ask a question from the Q&A because it fits pretty well. Someone on Reddit was asking about Petite Vue as well, and was basically asking, is Petite Vue dead because it didn't get any updates for 2 years? And you back then also decided, okay, I'll put it out there. It works. I don't accept any like PRs, issues, and so on.
Yeah. So the question is, what defines an open source project as dead, right? I think it's just weird that people think if something doesn't get updated, it's dead. Like there are packages on NPM that still works really well, gets millions of downloads, but hasn't been updated in 5 years. And it's a finished piece of software, right? I prefer the term, done rather than dead.
Maybe let's say, is it still maintained, as in like, would you say you dedicate time to like maybe fix bugs, like triage issues people raising, or just like it's out there, you can use it and it's basically feature complete and done?
I would say I think it's done to the extent where even if I don't fix any bugs from now on, it would cover a lot of people use cases really, really well, right? Because the intended scope for Petite Vue to cover is intentionally small. So if your use case falls within that, it serves your purpose and it's good. So in terms of maintenance, there are two types of maintenance. One is you fix bugs. That is something that's objectively just not working as intended. And because the scope of Petite Vue is so small, there's just very little such things. I mean, I will probably just occasionally when I think of it, I'll go there and just take a look at the existing issues and see if there's any real legit bugs, I would still consider fixing them. That's something we can do. But I think in terms of scope, if people are coming to me and say, I want this feature in Petite Vue, sorry, that's just not going to happen because this is done. Like, this is the scope we want to do. If you want anything beyond Petite Vue and you don't have it, you can either use Alpine or you use Vue proper.
Totally makes sense. Yeah. Then I'm very happy for that answer as well. So it's not like Petite Vue is not recommending, where it's just like it's feature complete. If there are like actual bugs, as in like it should be different than it is right now, you might gonna fix them at some point. But as the surface is that small, it's also very unlikely that lots of these bugs will happen. So yeah. Good news, I would say.
Yeah, it's also extremely simple. I would be totally fine with someone just forking it if they have a bug they want to fix themselves.
I think someone forked it even to make a like CSP compliant version to make sure it like that all works with content security policies. Also like some time ago. So yeah, also very fair. So like it's that narrow feature scope. You can just fork it, apply it. It's all good. That's also the spirit of open source. Right, and then going down from there, now we I think kind of landed in the area where Vue 2 came out, like the first like major version bump from Vue 1 back then. What made you do breaking changes in the new major version? What changed compared to Vue 1?
So Vue 1, I think when we did Vue 1.0, from 0.x to 1.0, it was mostly stabilizing the template syntax. And the template syntax was pretty much set since the 1.0 era. I think the only thing regarding template syntax that changed after 1.0 was the slot syntax. That was really the only thing. For 2.0, I think the main idea is because, first of all, Vue 1's rendering strategy is coupled to the DOM, which means it actually, for example, even if you write a string template, the thing that Vue 1 does is it will insert your whole template as inner HTML to an empty div, then grab so then it's initiated as a tree of real DOM tree, and then Vue 1 will walk it, find all the directives as attributes, and then turn them into live bindings. So it's kind of like how Petite Vue worked. So Petite Vue is very similar to how Vue 1 works. But this strategy has limitations because it's the whole thing is like dependent on the DOM, dependent on inner HTML. It doesn't really have a proper compiler, so we can't really do any advanced stuff with the template. It also, when you have a lot of components, the cost of like creating a real DOM tree for that component and then sort of throwing it away is kind of expensive in a lot of cases. So there are a lot of things I wanted to improve in Vue 1, and also like the overall architecture of the whole thing. Right? So Vue 2 was pretty much a rewrite from the ground up compared to Vue 1. And luckily, we didn't have that many users compared to nowadays. So most of the breaking changes in Vue 2, people are like, well, okay, fine. I don't think we even had any major discussions about the things we did in Vue 2. We just like, here's Vue 2. It has a bunch of changes. You probably want to just start a new project with it. But Vue 2 really came along together with a more proper like build tool chain. We then quickly built Vue CLI for Vue 2. Right? We started doing single file components. I'm a little blurry on when we exactly did that, but I think Vue 2 kind of marks the transition from a primarily in-browser kind of progressive enhancement type of thing to something that's more designed for heavier single-page application, server-side rendering. Right? Server-side rendering was also the major thing in Vue 2. So in order to support server-side rendering, we actually introduced Virtual DOM internally. So Vue 2's compiler is a step up from Vue 1's, but it was still really, really rudimentary. It's based on the HTML parser written by John Resig. It's like a very simple HTML parser. And then on top of it, we did really hacky implementation. We call it a compiler, but it's like just a really simple and rudimentary. But it is able to compile a Vue template into a virtual DOM render function, and that allowed us to have something more proper for the build tools, and allowed us to actually have builds that's CSP compliant without a lot of overhead. Like in Vue 1, if you want a CSP based build, you actually have to include I think a JS tool called Esprima bundled in there. So the Vue 1 CSP build is like very heavy, like more than twice heavy as standard Vue itself. So in Vue 2, we kind of finally fixed that. So if you build it with the build tool chain, with the build step, we're now able to also drop the runtime compiler, so you don't have to ship the compiler to the browser. So that Vue 2 was really kind of like where we started having look more like today's framework, right? And in fact, a lot of people still use Vue 2 even today, and it's still working pretty well for them. You can build pretty much anything you can build today with Vue 2, I would say. But this kind of ties into why we did Vue 3, is there are still a lot of things today we take for granted, but that wasn't there in Vue 2.
So you would say also with Vue 2 introduction of server-side rendering that the shift towards like the more, this is like built for web apps, not just like on top of like a server rendered application already for like Laravel, Rails, and so on. And did you see, in terms of the community, did you also there see changes to like maybe attract people saying, oh yeah, I wanted to build, I don't know, my full front end in Angular or React or older frameworks as well before, and then moved over to Vue because of its, for example, single file components, its easiness to learn and so on?
Yeah, I think so. I think single file components was definitely one thing that attracted people. Like it's still today, like people will have very strong initial preferences when they just see an example component. Some people see the way React works and they immediately will be like, wow, like JSX looks terrible. Like I prefer something that's more HTML-like. But on the other hand, there will be other people who are like, wow, like JSX, awesome. It's everything in a single language. Component is a function, elegant. And they look at HTML, they'll be like, wow, I don't want to write strings. Like JavaScript inside HTML, what is that? You know? So people will have very different strong opinions. I guess back in the days before React was this dominant, people had a lot more leeway in just deciding which one they want to go with. Like in a company, you can just, because everything was pretty new back then, so people can just, I think at one time there were like 40 different implementations in To-Do MVC, and picking a framework was kind of like this really, really, really difficult thing. Like there wasn't a clear winner back then. Like some bigger companies would go with Angular, but I think Angular 2 kind of helped with Vue's adoption in a way because of the huge breaking changes. A lot of Angular 1 users kind of probably moved towards Vue. People back then wouldn't say, I will learn React because I want a job. You know, they'll be more like, this is what I like, I'll learn this. Nowadays, unfortunately, a lot more people use something they prefer less for work because it makes them money. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it is nowadays. But I think, you know, yeah, like you said, I think in the early days, you know, Vue 2, the way SFC works, you know, the way we had a CLI, hot module replacement, state management, routing, you know, it's kind of like, I think Vue 2 is also the stage where we essentially coined the term the progressive framework, and we define Vue as this like incrementally adoptable framework compared to something more monolithic like Ember or Angular, which are intentionally monolithic. It's like all or nothing. If you use Angular or Ember, you need to just like give in to the way the framework is orchestrated and just like accept there's a way to do everything the Ember way or the Angular way. I think Vue is a bit more like, because it started with this very like progressive enhancement base, right? So you can still use Vue core for just that. But on top of that, if you want a single page routing, you can add the router. If you want state management, you can add it. If you want to start with the CLI, you can do that. Right? So when you start with the CLI, it becomes more framework-like. It will guide you to set up things like Babel. It will guide you to set up the router, unit testing, end-to-end testing, and all that stuff. So it becomes much more engineering and framework-oriented. So we give you this whole spectrum of how much you want to use from Vue, right? Try to cater to different use cases. I think that's a strength of Vue still today. But it also, creates a lot of design constraints on what we can and cannot do, right? So I would say there are trade-offs, but it's also what uniquely defines Vue in today's landscape.
And I like that approach of having all of these batteries included is kind of the phrase that's often used. And like a framework like React, one of the challenges that I know people have with it is that you have to decide what state management you want to use and what router you want to use. I think it's maybe less of a thing now. Like you were saying, it's, several years ago, there were all these different options. So you could kind of pick and choose whatever you wanted. And that was kind of the fun part for people, is that, oh, hey, there's this new state management thing. I could try that. I could try Redux, or I could try this whatever thing, but you had to kind of like assemble it on your own. Whereas with Vue, it's more of like the Rails approach or other, like these other frameworks where there's just kind of like the standard solution and like everyone uses it. And so you don't have to, like worry about, is this going to be supported over the long term? Is this the right choice? Like how do these things interact? You just kind of like decide if you want it or not.
Yeah, I think we are more in between. Say React is on one end of the spectrum. It's like before React started with server-side components. So for a very, very long time, React is just like, we are only a rendering library and everything else is up to the community. And Angular and Ember, on the other hand, is we take care of everything from build tooling to data fetching, all the way that touches the server. We're going to cover all that, right? And Vue is somewhere in between. It's like you can use Vue just as a rendering library, but you can also use Vue like a full framework. But we're less opinionated than these full monolithic ones. We're a bit more opinionated than something like React. So give you a good balance. Like to some people, actually I've heard some people who love Angular because they just love the strictness. They love having the framework guide their hand every step of the way. To them, even Vue is too like flexible, too loose. So different people will have different preferences.
That's for sure. I also wonder like where to make the cut, as in like, okay, now we provide like there is the Vue router, there is state management, like in terms of UX, of course, Pinia nowadays. But for example, there was never a default like HTTP fetching library like Angular had with HTTP client. Was it difficult to like find a good balance to like make sure, okay, that's what we want to include out of the box, or like as an add-in, but supported straight away from the team, versus that's something that's up to the community or the people using the framework?
Yeah, I think fetching library is a good example because it's just not framework specific. Like there's nothing that requires the fetch implementation to be coupled to Vue in any way. Because I think one of the reasons Angular always had its own HTTP fetching is because it uses dirty checking. And when it does dirty checking, it needs to know when a data request is finished so it can force the digest cycle to run again. But Vue doesn't have that problem because after you finish fetching the data, you will always set it back into some reactive state, and that will trigger the rendering. So the framework knows exactly when the data fetching is finished. But in Angular land, they don't have that, so they have to kind of sort of take over. And in Angular 2, they use something like Zone.js that tries to like just intercept everything, all the async stuff, which still isn't fully bulletproof, right? And Zone has caused a lot of problems over the years, and people are still trying to get rid of it. So for Vue, it's like in the early days, a lot of people used Axios, but later on, there's native fetch nowadays. So, right, I think that's a good decision. Now we don't have to tell people, say, hey, Vue HTTP is now deprecated. Use fetch instead.
It's true. Well, like on the Angular side, okay, like Zone.js get rid of, we have all signals there, and then like, okay, do we really need HTTP client, or can we just use like normal fetch? So like, yeah, it's a bit of the extra burden that the necessity of having a fetch library gives them now. And that's a good point of like, okay, we want to add framework specific things and give then like kind of the one way to go. And if there are like community options, sure, why not? But yeah, there's one big Vue.js router, there's one state management tool. In a way, like their Vue's opinionatedness, let's say, shows, but it's also good because then people don't have like the analysis paralysis of like the fatigue of choosing things like JavaScript frameworks in general.
Yeah.
So that's definitely a good thing, and it's also nice to see that Vue 2 like grew eventually into all that, saying like, okay, we bring Vuex, we bring the router, we have concepts for that, and people could always rely on that these things, they will work, they are maintained. Mm-hmm. So I think also like the stability of Vue 2 was a key part as well, that people are like, okay, here's another major version, we have to update now and again and again. I think that's also a big factor.
So with Vue 3, you had mentioned Vue 2 kind of gave people some options. It wasn't super strict like Angular, but it wasn't like, choose your own adventure completely. Yeah. And I think in Vue 3, one of the interesting things is that you added in the composition API, which sort of gave people choice in how to write logic, where the options API is a bit more strict in how you structure things, whereas the composition API gives you more flexibility. So how was that transition from Vue 2 to Vue 3, along with the composition API and all of that?
Yeah, I think so. Vue 2 to Vue 3 is definitely probably the most challenging and grueling process or period I've experienced in the whole 10 years of working on Vue. I think even to this day there are still lingering just like arguments about options versus composition. It just takes a very, very long time for the community to move on, right? So kind of want to go back to why we started the idea about composition API in the first place, right? So one of the big issues in Vue 2 is TypeScript support isn't quite there. So options API, when it was designed, didn't really even take type inference in mind. So it wasn't really designed in a way to be easily type friendly, especially with mixings. Mixings are extremely hard to type properly. So nowadays in Vue 3, if you use options API with mixing, we can actually infer most of the stuff, which is amazing. But if you look at the types that we had to write to get mixings inferred properly, it's just so much extra effort compared to composition API, where everything is just functions. It just naturally works with TypeScript, has better type inference performance. It's easier to reason about in type land in most cases. Right? So that's one of the things that kind of pushed us to think about a different API that is designed with type inference in mind. Unfortunately, we can't just get rid of options API, so we have to carry along the burden of all the types that we wrote for options API. But in a way, like we want a new API that's just more type friendly from the get-go. And also mixings is like the bane of both maintainability and type inference, right? It's hard to infer types. Also for users, if you use a bunch of mixings, you don't even know where these properties come from, right? So really wanted a API that enables better logic reuse compared to mixings, and also wanted the API to allow people to have a more higher upper ceiling in how to organize your code, right? Options API forces you to group everything by type. So if we go back to like single file components, when it first came out, there were a bunch of people who were like, oh, you're mixing 3 different languages in a single file. Where is separation of concern, right? This very old argument about you should have 3 directories, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and put all your files in these 3 categories. That's like options API to me nowadays, right? So when you transition over to thinking about components, a component is a unit, self-contained unit that contains the cross-cutting concerns from all 3 different layers, but they are related to the same unit of logical concern. And composition API essentially gives you the ability to think about all your logic in the same way. So instead of thinking about here's data, here's computer, here's methods, it's like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You can now choose to cut a piece of it out and say, here's a composable. It has all the things that's related to this specific logical concern. I can move it anywhere I want. I can put it inside my component. I can move it outside of the component and share it between multiple components. Or I can even extract it into a library and share with other people, share with other projects. I think that's super powerful. And you can do that while having proper type inference all the way through. And you never get lost with where a property comes from, because they always get returned from function calls. You can always just go to definition and you see exactly how they are created. So all of these just adds up to the overall maintainability of large projects, which we've seen over the years. People just struggle with Options API. Like, I think a lot of proponents of Options API really I think it works for them. It's great because their project just isn't huge, right? There is a scaling limit to Options API, where if you have a huge project, multiple people working on, you have a component that's hundreds of lines long, it's not going to be fun. It's just not. But with Composition API, I think people don't realize is it's kind of like building, some like a model kit. One version is it only has a fixed way of putting it together, and you have to strictly follow the instructions. So you don't need to use too much of your brain. You just follow all the instructions and things falls into place and you have something. But that's the only thing you can build. And if you follow the instruction, that's the only outcome that's possible, right? But on the other hand, if you're something like Lego, you can use your creativity a bit more. But if you don't use your brain, you just randomly put things together, it's going to be a mess. But if you use your brain and think about a design, and you think about, I'm going to build this nice piece of Lego. Now you can use your creativity to build something that's probably better than an off-the-shelf, thing that you can think of, right? So the upper ceiling is higher without Composition API. And I also compare that to writing Composition API code is more similar to writing normal JavaScript, right?
Definitely.
Right. So it's like, if you write messy code with Composition API, you probably write messy code with normal JavaScript modules too, because you don't think about how to group your variables and your functions together. How do you make abstractions? How do you split out modules? Right? You think about all that when you're writing normal JavaScript. Composition API kind of forces you to think about these same concerns when you're writing Vue component code. So that is indeed a lot more you need to think about compared to Options API. But that also allows you to apply all your JavaScript skills in terms of how do you write nice abstractions? How do you organize code neatly? How do you make them maintainable? All these skills that's applicable to writing good JavaScript now apply to writing good Composition API code, right? So in a way, if you are a good JavaScript developer, you will find Composition API more, liberating, because now you can fully leverage your skills as a JavaScript developer, right? But I also understand if you don't want to just spend time thinking about writing good JavaScript code, I want to just get my hands held all the time. I don't want to think, right? Options API might still be a better fit, but as I said, Vue's user base changed over time. We now have real Vue users who are trying to build really complex stuff. And maybe they are really good skilled developers who can write really well-maintained JavaScript code. So it would be a pity if we lock them into the upper ceiling created by Options API forever, right? So in a way, my motivation is to create this alternative API that unlocks that ceiling for them, right? So unfortunately, to some users, it might not be the most ideal trade-off, because they probably never hit that ceiling. So to them, Composition API is just something overhead. I don't need, right? Yeah. Overhead, right? Which is unfortunate, but I think it's a result of Vue's user base being really, really diverse. And tough decisions have to be made. We try to make sure that if the existence of Composition API won't affect how your Options API code works, right? In fact, you can even easily leverage composables used by other people if you still prefer to write options, right? You just use the setup hook and you can still use composables. So we definitely tried our best to find the right balance. I think it's just it's not quite possible to make everything perfect for everyone. someone will complain, but I think we tried our best. I'm pretty happy with the outcome in general. I think Composition API achieved all the goals that we set out to do. It had better TypeScript support. It unlocked logic reuse and composition. It increased the maintainability ceiling, right? It spawned projects like Vue use, and it's now the preferred way to write components for most new users. So I think we achieved most of the things we want to achieve with Composition API, but Options API is probably going to be here to stay for as long as we know.
That's a good one, because that's definitely one of the big questions, and also came up in the last weeks before the recording here. Like there was a bit of social media drama about oh yeah, Composition API versus Options API. Here we go again. And of course, people were like, okay, will the Options API stay? You said multiple times it will. You also made it clear on Twitter. But is there an end of life at some point planned for the Options API, or will it probably around for years to come, or even quote unquote forever?
The cost of keeping Options API around is very, very low, because there's literally no maintenance burden for it nowadays. It's just a really thin layer that's on top of Composition API. All the bugs we fix, it applies to both API styles pretty much. So yeah, I don't really see there's no reason for us to remove it, other than I think even if we want to encourage people to use Composition API, we will do so by just tweaking the documentation. One thing that we acknowledge is that I've heard this from some people who've recently picked up Vue, and they're pretty advanced developers. So their primary question is, when they first look at the documentation, they see the API style toggle.
Yeah.
And naturally, they want to understand how both API works, because they want to make an informed decision. But unfortunately, that just creates this extra mental overhead. People hate having to make decisions when they first learning something. But we throw this big decision right in front of them at the very beginning. It's kind of off-putting to new users. I think at one point, we'll just have to be more opinionated and just be the doc. We will assume a lot more things. Because right now, we have to assume, do you use a build tool? Do you prefer Options API or Composition API? This just leads to all these different branches. It's a whole decision matrix. And that kind of blurs people, because I think most new users nowadays, especially when they try to compare Vue to other frameworks, for example, Svelte, it has only one default way of using it. That's with a build tool, right? So if people are comparing that, they're like, okay, Svelte just directly shows me the only way of doing things, but Vue gives me this 4 different branches. Now I have to figure it out. And just kind of, creates a bunch of barrier they have to jump through before they get to know, oh, this is actually the happy place, But that takes time, right? Because when we first did Vue 3, the new documentation, I think having both Composition API and Options API in there is still definitely necessary. We kind of want to give them equal weight, equal treatment.
100%. I mean, there's so much content also still in the Options API, which is another thing. I personally like to know both APIs, not for straight away jumping into development, but more okay, it's still good to see, oh yeah, there's an older resource about, I don't know, a certain library to use, certain pattern. And it's still good to see, okay, this is Options API, but I can still read it and transfer it over Composition API because I know both.
Yeah. I think over time, we will, unfortunately, we will always have these existing content that's created using certain dialect. I think the most damaging part, the period where we shipped Vue 3, but we didn't have script setup. That's between 3.0 and 3.2.
Yeah.
That was probably the most hurting period, where there were a lot of articles written online introducing Composition API, but it's using this whole setup return syntax.
The verbose one, yeah.
Yeah, and some people using other frameworks during that period will be like, oh, let's check out Vue Composition API. And I see that, they'll be like, I don't know about that, right? So I think that's kind of a mistake on our side. We should have just shipped with script setup straight away. But unfortunately, we kind of, again, didn't do that up front. In hindsight, we should have just maybe shipped Composition API with script setup from day one. But when people say, show me what a Vue component looks like, we'll show them the default. That's SFC with script setup, because we believe that is the most reasonable way for you to start a new application nowadays, given all the support, given all the ecosystem tooling and everything, and the maturity. So it's at a point where we can now recommend that as the default. So probably in the next year, we're going to do another revamp of the documentation and start to kind of be more opinionated on, like, if you're just getting started, this is the way of doing things. There's no decisions to make. When you get a bit more comfortable with this, you can then explore alternative options. We'll make you aware of those options exist. We'll still properly document them, but we want the default onboarding path to get rid of all those decision matrix and just like one straight way. And you get to something that you can like confidently say, now I know how Vue works. I can build something with it. And now I discover, okay, there are also all these other ways of doing it. But if I'm already happy with the default way, I probably don't even need to, spend too much brain trying to figure out whether I should even use them.
Yeah, and if it's not a lot of cost to keep the options API around, I think it makes sense for sure to keep it around, especially because of the whole spirit of Vue in keeping, you can just drop it in a script tag.
Yeah.
You can use the options API. That's a little
I think options API is still better suited for the drop in through a script tag case, right? That's also one of the big reasons we want to keep it around.
Very good point.
Yeah.
Maybe you've seen Justin Schrader's proposal saying like, hey, at some point maybe it would be good to like put the options API behind a flag. I mean, there's a compile time flag already, or compiler flag already saying, let's remove the options API fully to make the bundle even leaner if you really don't use it at all. Have you thought about that a bit more? And is it a way you could imagine pursuing, or maybe not, like in the future, like not tomorrow, of course?
Yeah, I think you can already do that today, right? It's really just a matter of flipping a boolean as the default. I think we'll need an RFC on that, probably. I'm personally leaning towards we probably can consider doing it in Vue 4. I think in a lot of things we do in Vue 4 that will be considered breaking changes, just really like changing how something works by default rather than changing the way it completely works. I think Vue 2 to Vue 3, the biggest issue in the breaking changes, a lot of them are kind of like these low-level changes where it makes it really difficult for automatic migration. But something like a configuration flag that changes the default value, or just like options that flips the value, these are extremely easy to migrate. So so breaking changes in Vue 4 were probably more along those lines. It's really just like we will also most likely have a version where you can say like turn a flag on like opting to all these individual. It's kind of like migration build, but much easier, more compatible. Yeah.
That totally makes sense. And I hope somebody will come up with the RFC just to see where things are going. Maybe let's stay a little bit longer with Vue 3 and the composition API, because maybe some of the listeners or viewers don't know that like composition API as it is now, even without script setup, was not the first way of proposing a different API. Before, there were experiments with a class-based API. Maybe you can tell a bit about that and why eventually it wasn't used, and the composition API as we know it now is a thing.
Yeah, we definitely we did have our RFC exploring class API before we went with composition API. It was also motivated by type checking because classes are quite type friendly as well. Unfortunately, in order to support the full range of features that we want and be expressive, we really needed decorators. Like you can't really cover the full range of things you want to do without decorators. And so when we look at the decorators, it was still a stage 2 proposal, and it was really in flux. Like, because I followed along the TC39 discussions for decorators during that period, and there's just so many disagreements, and discussions seem to be going nowhere, and it just feels extremely risky. to rely on that behavior, because TypeScript back then implemented decorators, which is now considered legacy. Right, the behavior is completely different from today's standardized decorators. So at the time we were considering it, I just felt it's just way too risky to base a whole new API design on something that's still like highly in flux. And I think that bet was kind of right, because later on, the decorators proposal went through a complete overhaul. So the stage 3 version of the decorators was like completely different from the stage 2 one that was there when we were discussing class-based APIs.
It was also like a totally new thing, I think, for TC39 proposal, changing that much from 2 to 3.
Yeah, it's just like, because I was a bit, I saw the way people went about the proposal. It just felt like people seems to be just disagreeing on a lot of things. And I don't think the proposal is going to stay the way it is when it eventually lands. Right. So it's kind of like, not just because of stage 2, but because I was also a bit involved in the process and saw how it was going and felt it was just really risky. And I think like when decorators changed a bit, like it also caused issues in Angular, for example, like where can you place the decorator on like default exports? Right, the spec kind of changed where you like, can you place it before the export default, or do you have to do export default then decorator then the thing? That kind of caused trouble in Angular too.
Yeah, I think all in all, like it was a very good bet to go on the composition API as it is now. I think the only thing that probably people used class-based components in Vue 2, then they might have a harder time, or like had a harder time migrating to the composition API. That probably was more one of the downsides.
Overall, I think in Vue 2, we definitely like try to support different kind of use cases. Like someone builds Vue class component, people like it, so we're like, okay, sure. Because at that time, it was really a way for people to get better TypeScript support. And basically, we're saying if you are willing to opt into this experimental decorator stuff, this might be the thing for you. But I think once we had composition API, we realized there are just too many ways of writing Vue components at one point. And we really need to just kind of narrow it down once again. So in Vue 3, we just decided, okay, like class components, now it's just a completely community thing. If you want to use it, there are still people maintaining something called Vue facing decorators, I think, which is, in my opinion, like if you really like classes, you can use that. But at the same time, I think from a framework's perspective, it's not really reasonable for you to demand a framework to bend the fundamental way it works to cater to your personal preference. In that case, you should just use a framework that better is like class by default, like Angular. That's fine. If you prefer classes, right? Or you maintain your own abstraction on top of Vue and leverage everything that we provide that suits your needs. But in a way, we just decided we no longer want to take on the responsibility and maintenance burden of having to make everything class component compatible.
Totally makes sense. On that note, you said like classes in Vue, like not only class components, but using maybe classes with the reactivity API that Vue provides. Do you have the feeling that's also a bit more tricky than objects and like arrays, like the more primitive types?
I think it works fine in most cases. I actually see quite a few people do that, like from reproductions or things we see. The only tricky part is classes can have all kinds of edge cases, like compared to plain values in closures. For example, some people will want to use private fields with a reactive object. That causes problem. Some people want reactivity in constructors. That has a problem, right? So classes is just a native construct that's a bit difficult for you to cover all the edge cases. That's why we generally do not recommend people doing it. Like if you know all these gotchas and know how to avoid them, like don't expect reactivity in constructors, don't use private fields, you'll be fine. But if it just feels, if you have to like remember these rules, in order to use the reactivity API, why not just stick to the recommended way of having these things declared in a function scope? Yeah, but if you're willing to just step around those pitfalls and you're like, I still prefer classes, that still works. Yeah.
Fair. This was part 1 of the amazing interview with Avenue himself. We recorded almost 2 hours of raw materials, so we decided to split it into 2 parts. The next one will come next week around the same time. So until then, take a look at the earlier episodes of DejaVue, for example, with Daniel Rowe and other amazing guests. Tune in and let us know what you think. Of course, if you have any more questions, let us know on Twitter, write us an email, or comment on your favorite platform on YouTube. Stay tuned and talk to you next week. See ya until then.